My name is Amora. I am 31 years old. And this is the story of the afternoon everything changed, the moment when years of swallowed insults and quiet humiliation finally crystallized into something I could hold in my hands, something I could use to reshape the narrative that had been written for me without my consent. The house was filled with people, relatives and neighbors and children from my daughter's preschool class, their voices rising and falling in that particular rhythm of social gatherings where everyone is performing the version of themselves they want others to see. My daughter, Sophia, was the light of my life, a small bundle of energy and joy who seemed oblivious to the undercurrents that ran through every family gathering like dark water beneath a frozen lake. She darted between the legs of adults, her laughter bright and genuine, her hands already sticky from the cake she had been sneaking bites of whenever she thought no one was looking. Watching her, I felt that familiar ache in my chest, the one that came from knowing that I would do anything to protect her from the toxicity that lived in this family, from the judgment that had been passed down through generations like some poisonous heirloom. I had married into this family believing that love was enough, that Daniel and I could build something separate and beautiful, but I had been naive. Families are ecosystems, and every member affects every other member, and there was no way to insulate myself or my daughter from the steady drip of contempt that his mother and sister directed toward me whenever Daniel's back was turned. The birthday party had been my mother-in-law's idea, of course. Victoria had insisted on hosting it at her house, a large colonial in an upscale neighborhood that always smelled faintly of potpourri and polished wood, a house that felt more like a museum than a home. She had taken control of the planning, the guest list, the menu, treating me like an incompetent child who couldn't be trusted with something as simple as a 5-year-old's birthday celebration. I had learned to pick my battles over the years, and this was not one I had the energy to fight. So I had smiled and nodded and thanked her for her help, even as I felt myself being erased from my own daughter's party, even as I watched her take credit for decisions I had made, even as I stood in the background of my own life like a supporting character in someone else's story. Victoria was the kind of woman who had never quite recovered from the realization that she was no longer the most important woman in her son's life. She wore her resentment like expensive jewelry, displaying it prominently while pretending it was something else entirely. Her hair was perfectly styled, her clothes immaculately tailored, her home decorated with the kind of aggressive good taste that announced her status to anyone who entered. Everything about her was calculated to project an image of effortless superiority, and I had been a threat to that image from the moment Daniel first brought me home. I was not from their world. My parents were teachers, not executives. My clothes came from department stores, not boutiques. My education was practical, not prestigious. In Victoria's eyes, I was a step down for her son, a mistake he would eventually realize, a temporary phase he would outgrow when he finally understood what he had given up by marrying outside his class. And then there was Elena, Daniel's older sister, who had made it her personal mission to remind me of my place at every opportunity. Elena was 2 years older than Daniel, unmarried by choice, or so she claimed, though I suspected her sharp tongue and critical nature had more to do with her single status than any independent inclination. She worked in finance, lived in a downtown apartment that cost more than my parents' house, and treated me with the kind of dismissive tolerance one might show to a stray cat that had wandered into a garden party. She never missed an opportunity to mention the expensive gifts she bought for Sophia, the exclusive schools she had researched, the connections she could provide if Daniel would just see reason about the kind of life his daughter should have. Every word from her mouth was a small cut, barely visible on its own, but accumulating over time into a wound that never quite healed. I had met Daniel 8 years ago at a coffee shop, where I was working my way through graduate school, pulling espresso shots, and trying to figure out what I wanted to do with a degree in literature that everyone told me was impractical. He had come in every morning for a week before finally asking for my number, and something about the way he looked at me, like I was a person rather than a barista, had made me say yes. Our first date had been dinner at a small Italian restaurant where we talked for 4 hours straight, and by the time he walked me to my car, I knew that I was in trouble. He was kind in a way that felt genuine, not performative. He listened when I spoke, asked follow-up questions, remembered details from previous conversations. He made me feel seen in a way I hadn't known I was missing. By our 3rd month together, I was half in love with him, and by our 6th month, I knew that this was the person I wanted to build a life with. Meeting his family had been a shock. I had expected them to be like him, warm and welcoming, but what I found instead was a wall of polite hostility that I couldn't quite understand. Victoria had smiled at me with her mouth while her eyes remained cold, assessing, calculating. Elena had asked questions that felt more like interrogations, wanting to know where I had gone to school, what my parents did, where I saw myself in 5 years. Every answer I gave seemed to confirm what they already believed, that I was not good enough, that I was a mistake, that Daniel would come to his senses eventually. I had left that first dinner with a knot in my stomach and a growing awareness that loving Daniel would mean surviving his family. The engagement had been a battle from the start. Victoria had wanted a formal engagement party at their country club, a guest list filled with people I didn't know, a celebration that felt more like a business transaction than a declaration of love. I had wanted something small, intimate, meaningful. Daniel had tried to mediate, but his instinct was always to keep the peace, to give his mother what she wanted in hopes that she would eventually accept me. The engagement party had been a 3-hour exercise in endurance, me smiling through conversations where I was introduced as Daniel's fiancée, without any reference to my name, my accomplishments, my identity as a separate human being rather than an accessory to her son. I had drunk too much champagne that night just to numb the edges of my own awareness. The wedding had been worse. Victoria had hijacked the planning process at every turn, overruling my preferences with the kind of gracious condescension that made me look ungrateful if I objected. The flowers were wrong, the color scheme was wrong, the venue was too small, too simple, too common. She had invited 100 people I had never met, and on the day itself, I had felt like a prop in someone else's fantasy, a bride in a dress she hadn't chosen, reciting vows in a church she hadn't selected, surrounded by people who looked at her with barely concealed curiosity and not a small amount of pity. Daniel had held my hand through it all, whispering that it would be worth it, that once we were married, things would settle down, that his mother just needed time to adjust. I had wanted to believe him. I had wanted to believe that love was enough to overcome the steady erosion of my selfhood. The first year of our marriage had been a lesson in disappointment. Victoria called every Sunday without fail, conversations that always seemed to circle back to some criticism or another. My housekeeping wasn't up to her standards. My cooking was too simple, too ethnic, too unrefined. My career choices were impractical, and wasn't it time I thought about something more stable, more appropriate for someone married to her son? Elena's visits were less frequent, but more cutting, each one leaving me with a new collection of backhanded compliments to dissect and internalize. I had started seeing a therapist around this time, a quiet woman named Dr. Chen, who helped me understand that the constant criticism wasn't about me at all, but about their need to maintain a hierarchy where I was always at the bottom. Understanding it didn't make it easier to endure, but it helped me stop internalizing every insult as evidence of my own inadequacy. When Sophia was born, I had foolishly hoped that a grandchild might soften Victoria's edges, might give us common ground, might finally make me a real member of the family rather than a tolerated intrusion. And for a brief moment, there had been a glimmer of something like acceptance. Victoria had come to the hospital, had held Sophia with what looked like genuine tenderness, had said the right things about how beautiful she was, how perfect. But within weeks, the criticism had started again, now redirected through the lens of motherhood. I was breastfeeding too long or not long enough. I was spoiling the baby. I was too anxious, too indulgent, too soft. The nurse they had hired without consulting me, the one who came 3 times a week to help, was really there to monitor, to report back, to ensure that I was raising Sophia according to Victoria's standards rather than my own. I remember one afternoon when Sophia was 6 months old, I had come home from a doctor's appointment to find Victoria in my kitchen, rearranging the cabinets because she didn't approve of how I had organized the baby bottles. She hadn't asked permission. She hadn't called ahead. She had simply let herself in with the spare key Daniel had given her years ago, a key I had asked him to retrieve more than once, a request he always seemed to forget. That afternoon, standing in my own kitchen watching my mother-in-law reorganize my life without my consent, something had shifted in me. The anger I had been suppressing for years had risen to the surface, hot and bright, and for the first time I had said no. I had told her to stop. I had told her that this was my home and my child and my way of doing things, and I didn't need her interference. She had looked at me with something like surprise, then something like contempt, and had left without a word. But that night, Daniel had received a long phone call from his mother, and the look on his face when he hung up told me everything I needed to know about how the conversation had gone. The years that followed were a war of attrition, small battles fought over holidays and birthday parties and family dinners, each one leaving me more exhausted, more resigned, more convinced that I would never truly belong. I had stopped fighting back somewhere along the way, stopped defending myself, stopped trying to prove my worth to people who had already decided I had none. I had poured my energy into Sophia, into my work, into the few friendships I had managed to maintain despite the isolation that came from being constantly on guard. I had learned to find my worth in places where Victoria and Elena couldn't touch it, in my daughter's laughter and my students' progress, and the quiet moments when Daniel and I were alone together, when he was the man I had fallen in love with rather than the son trying to balance impossible loyalties. But the birthday party, Sophia's 5th birthday party, was different. I don't know if it was the milestone, the number 5 feeling significant somehow, or if it was simply that they had finally pushed me too far, finally crossed a line I hadn't even known existed until I found myself standing on the other side of it. The day had started normally enough, or what passed for normal in this family. I had arrived early to help set up, knowing that Victoria would have everything under control and would resent my interference even as she criticized my lack of involvement. I had brought the cake I had made myself, a vanilla sponge with buttercream frosting that I had decorated with Sophia's favorite characters, a labor of love that had taken me 2 days to complete. Victoria had received it with the kind of faint praise that was worse than outright criticism, setting it on the dessert table alongside the professional cake she had ordered, as if my contribution was a sweet but unnecessary addition to the real celebration. Sophia had been ecstatic, running from room to room, greeting guests with her particular brand of unfiltered enthusiasm, oblivious to the tensions that hummed beneath the surface of every interaction. I had watched her with a mixture of love and anxiety, wanting her to enjoy her day, wanting to protect her from the family dynamics she was still too young to understand. The guests had arrived in waves, neighbors and preschool families, and the inevitable parade of relatives from Daniel's side, each one offering congratulations and presents, and the kind of small talk that feels obligatory rather than genuine. I had performed my role as hostess, making sure everyone had drinks, introducing myself to parents I didn't recognize, thanking people for coming with a smile that never quite reached my eyes. It was around 2 o'clock, the party at its peak, when I first noticed the change in the room's atmosphere. Victoria had been watching me all afternoon, her gaze following me from group to group, a predator tracking prey that had wandered too far from the safety of the herd. Elena had been stationed near the drink table, her position seemingly casual, but her attention fixed on my movements with an intensity that made my skin prickle. I had been laughing at something a neighbor said, a genuine laugh for once, when I felt the weight of their attention like a hand pressing against my chest. I had turned toward the drink table, suddenly aware that I was thirsty, suddenly aware that something was different, something was wrong. The movement was small, nearly imperceptible, the kind of gesture you might miss if you weren't looking for it, if you hadn't spent years learning to read the micro-expressions of people who meant you harm. Victoria's hand had moved toward my glass, the one I had set down moments earlier, the one that contained nothing but lemonade and ice. Her fingers had made contact with something in her palm, a small packet or vial I couldn't quite see, and with a motion so practiced it could only have been rehearsed, she had slipped something into my drink. The powder had dissolved almost instantly, invisible against the pale yellow of the lemonade, and if I hadn't been watching, if I hadn't turned at exactly that moment, I would never have known. But I had seen it. I had seen it clearly. And in that instant, Everything I had ever suspected about this family, everything I had ever feared, crystallized into a single, undeniable truth. They were capable of anything. My first thought was for Sophia. Where was she? Was she safe? I had scanned the room frantically, my heart hammering against my ribs until I spotted her in the corner with a group of children, her face smeared with frosting, her laughter carrying across the room like a lifeline. She was fine. She was happy. She was oblivious. And suddenly I understood that I had a choice to make. I could confront Victoria, cause a scene, expose what she had done and face the inevitable denials and counter-accusations that would follow. I could drink the lemonade and accept whatever consequences came, trusting that whatever she had put in it wouldn't kill me, wouldn't take me away from my daughter. Or I could do something else, something I had never done before, something that would shift the balance of power in ways I couldn't fully predict. My body had gone cold, then hot, then cold again as the reality of what I had witnessed settled into my bones. This wasn't just another insult, another slight, another attempt to make me feel small. This was physical. This was dangerous. This was a line I hadn't thought anyone could cross, and yet Victoria had crossed it with the same casual entitlement she brought to every interaction, as if poisoning me was simply another way of expressing her displeasure, another tool in her arsenal of control. And Elena, standing nearby, had seen it too. Her lips had curled into a smile that made my stomach turn, a smile that said she was enjoying this, that she had been waiting for this, that whatever was about to happen was exactly what I deserved in her eyes. The moment stretched, elastic and strange, and in that suspended space, I felt something shift inside me. The fear I had lived with for years, the constant low-grade anxiety that had become so familiar I barely noticed it anymore, suddenly transformed into something else entirely. Clarity. A pure, crystalline clarity that cut through the noise and confusion and showed me exactly what I needed to do. I had spent years swallowing their insults, swallowing my pride, swallowing my anger and hurt and despair. I had made myself small to survive. I had accepted their definition of me because fighting it seemed impossible, because the energy required to defend myself was energy I needed for other things, because somewhere along the way I had started to believe that maybe they were right. Maybe I was lucky to be tolerated. Maybe I should be grateful for whatever scraps of acceptance they threw my way. But this was different. This crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, that couldn't be explained away or minimized or blamed on my own oversensitivity. This was a crime, literal and figurative, and standing there in my daughter's birthday party. Surrounded by people who smiled at me with eyes that didn't care, I made a decision. I wasn't going to swallow this. I wasn't going to accept it. I wasn't going to let them hurt me one more time and walk away clean. And the most beautiful part was that I didn't have to say a word. I didn't have to accuse or confront or expose. All I had to do was nothing, or rather, something that would look like nothing, something that would be deniable, something that would give them a taste of their own medicine without ever acknowledging that I knew what they had done. My hands were steady as I walked toward the drink table, my face arranged into an expression of pleasant neutrality, my body language relaxed and unthreatening. Victoria watched me approach, her eyes flicking between my face and the glass she had poisoned, calculating, assessing, trying to read my intentions. Elena's smile had widened, anticipation bright in her eyes, certain that I was about to drink what had been prepared for me, certain that whatever Victoria had put in that glass would have its intended effect. They had planned this together, I realized. This wasn't spontaneous. This wasn't a moment of weakness. This was deliberate, calculated, a trap they had set together, waiting for the perfect moment to spring it. The room seemed to narrow to a single point as I reached the table, my fingers closing around the glass that had been meant for me. The lemonade looked innocent enough, pale and clear, giving no indication of what lurked beneath its surface. I could smell the vanilla frosting from the cake table nearby, could hear Sophia's laughter from across the room, could feel the weight of Victoria's gaze pressing against me like a physical force. The glass was cold against my palm, condensation beating on its surface, and I thought about what it would mean to drink it, what it would mean to accept this violation of my body and my dignity, what it would mean to let them win one more time. Then I looked at Elena, really looked at her, taking in the satisfaction on her face, the certainty in her posture, the absolute confidence that I would play the role they had written for me. And I saw something else, too. I saw the exhaustion beneath her perfectly applied makeup, the brittleness in her smile, the way her fingers tapped against her champagne flute with a restless energy that betrayed her own discomfort. She wasn't as confident as she wanted to appear. She wasn't as secure. And suddenly I understood that both of these women, for all their power and privilege and certainty, were deeply, profoundly afraid. Afraid of losing control. Afraid of being exposed. Afraid of whatever truth I might carry that threatened the carefully constructed reality they had built for themselves. I had picked up the glass and turned toward Elena, my movements casual, my smile unforced, my voice light as I said something about needing to take something for a headache and asking if she wanted my lemonade since I shouldn't mix it with medication. The words were innocent, plausible, the kind of exchange that could happen at any party, the kind of offer that would be rude to refuse. Elena had hesitated for just a moment, her eyes flicking to Victoria, a silent question passing between them. But what could they say? What could they do? To refuse would be suspicious, would draw attention, would raise questions they didn't want asked. And so Elena had taken the glass with a laugh that was too sharp, a why not that was too casual, and she had raised it to her lips. I watched her drink. I watched the lemonade disappear, the glass emptying in steady swallows, the poison entering her body with every sip. I watched Victoria's face as she realized what was happening, the flash of panic in her eyes, the sudden tension in her jaw. I watched Elena lower the glass, her smile still in place, her certainty still intact, completely unaware of what she had just consumed. And I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not satisfaction, exactly. Not pleasure. But something quieter, something deeper. A sense of balance restored. A sense of justice served. A sense of finally taking my power back. The first sign that something was wrong came about 15 minutes later. Elena had been circulating through the party, her usual confident self, accepting compliments on her dress and her gift, and her general existence with the practiced ease of someone who had been the center of attention her whole life. But gradually, so gradually that most people wouldn't have noticed, her smile had started to slip. She had pressed a hand to her stomach once, twice, 3 times, each gesture slightly more pronounced than the last. Her laughter had become brittle, then thin, then absent altogether. And then, in the middle of a conversation with one of Daniel's aunts, she had turned pale, a sickly gray-white that no amount of makeup could hide. Victoria had materialized at her side almost instantly, her hand on Elena's arm, her voice low and urgent, asking if she was all right, suggesting she sit down, offering to get her some water. The concern on her face was real, I realized, but it wasn't the concern of a mother for her daughter. It was the concern of someone who had just realized that her carefully laid plan had gone spectacularly wrong, that the weapon she had created was now pointing in an unexpected direction, that she had lost control of a situation that was never supposed to become visible in the first place. Elena had tried to wave off the attention, had tried to smile and say she was fine, just fine, but her body was betraying her. Her hand pressed more firmly against her stomach now, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid. I had been watching from across the room, Sophia in my arms, her small body warm and solid against mine, her attention fixed on the birthday cake she was about to cut. I should have felt something, I thought later. Guilt, maybe, or regret, or at least the discomfort of knowing that I had allowed something terrible to happen without intervening. But what I felt instead was a profound sense of calm, a stillness at the center of my being that I hadn't experienced in years, maybe ever. I had done nothing wrong. I had not poisoned anyone. I had not set this trap or baited it or sprung it. I had simply declined to step into the hole they had dug for me, and they had fallen into it themselves. Was it my fault that Elena had accepted a drink she should have refused? Was it my responsibility to protect her from the consequences of her own mother's actions? No, it wasn't. And for the first time since I had married into this family, I felt something like peace. The party had limped along for another 30 minutes, the atmosphere increasingly uncomfortable as Elena's condition worsened. She had retreated to the bathroom at one point, and the sounds that emerged had been impossible to ignore, had drawn glances and whispers, and the kind of speculative looks that Victoria had probably hoped to direct at me. By the time the cake was cut and presents were opened, and the last of the guests were making their excuses to leave, Elena had emerged from the bathroom looking wrecked, her makeup smeared, her hair disheveled, her face pale and sweaty. She had sat in a corner while Victoria hovered nearby, neither of them looking at me, neither of them acknowledging what had happened, both of them pretending that this was just an unfortunate case of food poisoning or a stomach bug or something, anything other than what it actually was. Daniel had been oblivious to most of it, his attention split between Sophia's delight at her presence and his sister's obvious distress. He had asked me later, on the drive home, what had happened, why Elena had gotten sick, why his mother had been acting so strangely. And I had told him everything. Not just about the party, but about all of it. The years of insults and criticisms, the constant undermining, the way they treated me when he wasn't around. The nurse they had hired to spy on me. The times they had shown up at our house unannounced and rearranged our lives without our consent. And finally, the thing I had seen that afternoon, the powder slipped into my drink, the trap they had set together, the crime they had been prepared to commit. He had been quiet for a long time after I finished, the silence stretching between us like a physical thing, and when he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion I had rarely heard from him. He hadn't known, he said. He hadn't realized how bad it was. He had wanted to believe that his family would eventually accept me, that time would soften their edges, that love would be enough to overcome whatever prejudices they held. But this, what they had tried to do, what they had done to Elena instead, this was something he couldn't ignore, couldn't explain away, couldn't forgive. He had pulled the car to the side of the road and turned to face me, and the look in his eyes was something I hadn't seen before, a combination of grief and fury, and something that might have been shame. That night, after Sophia was asleep in her bed, clutching the stuffed unicorn her grandmother had given her, Daniel and I sat at our kitchen table and had the conversation we should have had years ago. He admitted that he had always known, on some level, that his mother and sister were difficult, that their treatment of me was unfair, that he should have done more to defend me. He had been afraid, he said, of losing his family, of having to choose between them and me, of facing the possibility that they would never accept the woman he loved. But watching his sister get sick from poison meant for his wife, watching his mother's face as she realized what had happened, watching me remain calm and composed in the face of an attempt on my safety, something had shifted in him. He had seen, finally and clearly, what I had been living with for years, and he had chosen. He chose me. He chose us. He chose to be the husband and father I had always needed him to be, even if it meant losing the family he had grown up with. The weeks that followed were difficult. There were phone calls that went unanswered, text messages that were ignored, invitations that were declined. Victoria had tried at first to pretend nothing had happened, had called to ask about Sophia and make plans for Easter and suggest dinner at her house, all in that same gracious voice that hid steel beneath its velvet. When those attempts were met with silence, she had switched tactics, leaving messages that were increasingly desperate and then increasingly hostile, accusing me of turning her son against her, of poisoning his mind, of stealing her grandson from her. Elena had sent a single text, brief and cryptic. "I know what you did." I had deleted it without responding. What was there to say? She was right. I had done something. But so had they, and only one of us was willing to admit it. The family had circled the wagons, as I knew they would. I heard through the grapevine of mutual acquaintances that Victoria was telling stories about me, painting me as the villain in this particular drama. I was manipulative, she said. I was unstable. I was poisoning her son against his own family, using my daughter as a pawn in some elaborate revenge fantasy. I was dangerous, possibly criminal, definitely untrustworthy. The same labels she had always applied to me, just amplified for a larger audience. And for a while, I had worried about what people would think, whether they would believe her, whether I would become a pariah in the community we shared. But then I realized something important. The people who mattered already knew who I was. They had seen me at school events and neighborhood gatherings and birthday parties for other children. They had talked to me at length and watched me with my daughter and formed their own opinions based on their own observations. And the people who believed Victoria's stories without question were people I didn't need in my life anyway. 6 months after the birthday party, I ran into Victoria at a grocery store. It was the first time I had seen her since that afternoon, and the shock of recognition had frozen us both in place for a moment, our carts nearly colliding in the produce aisle. She had looked older, I thought, tired, the perfectly maintained facade showing cracks that no amount of skincare or styling could hide. Her eyes had met mine, and for a moment, just a moment, I had seen something there that looked like fear. Not anger or contempt, but genuine fear. The fear of someone who had realized too late that they had underestimated their opponent, that they had pushed too far and lost something they could never get back. I had nodded, polite but distant, and had continued down the aisle without a word. There was nothing left to say. A year later, our relationship with Daniel's family had settled into a distant détente. We saw them occasionally, at larger family gatherings that we couldn't avoid entirely, and we were civil in a way that satisfied the minimum requirements of social obligation. But the closeness they had expected, the access to Sophia they felt entitled to, the control over our lives they had always assumed was their right, all of that was gone. Daniel had set boundaries and enforced them consistently, something I had never been able to do on my own, and I had found a peace I hadn't known was possible, a freedom from the constant anxiety that had been my companion for so many years. I was still Amora. I was still the woman who had married into a family that never wanted her, but I was also something else now. I was a woman who knew her own worth. I was a mother who would protect her child at any cost. I was a survivor who had learned, finally and permanently, that she didn't have to swallow poison just because someone else had poured it. I think sometimes about what would have happened if I had made a different choice that afternoon. If I had confronted Victoria, if I had called the police, if I had drunk the lemonade myself and accepted whatever consequences came. Would anything have changed? Would they have finally seen me as a person worthy of respect? Or would they have found another way to dismiss me, to diminish me, to pretend that their cruelty was justified? I don't know the answer to those questions, and I never will. What I do know is this. On my daughter's 5th birthday, surrounded by people who smiled without meaning it, I made a choice that changed everything. I chose not to be a victim. I chose not to swallow what they were trying to feed me. I chose to stand up, smiling, and hand the glass to someone else. And in that moment, in that small, quiet act of defiance, I finally became the person I had always been meant to be. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever found yourself in a situation where the people who were supposed to love you treated you like an enemy, if you've ever had to choose between accepting abuse and finding a way to fight back, I want you to know something. You are not alone. And more importantly, you are not what they say you are. The labels they attach to you, the stories they tell about you, the version of you they have constructed in their minds to justify their treatment of you, none of it is real. You are whole and worthy and valuable exactly as you are. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to play the role they have written for you. Thank you for listening to my story. If it gave you chills, or hope, or even just a moment of distraction from whatever you are facing in your own life, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. And if you feel comfortable, I would love to hear your stories in the comments. What is the moment you finally took your power back? When did you realize that you didn't have to accept what they were offering? Every story matters. Every voice deserves to be heard. And together, we can remind each other that we are not the sum of what others believe about us, but the authors of our own lives.